Hey guys, fellow history enthusiasts. Tonight, we're delving into a rarely discussed reality, the stark, perilous, and far from glamorous existence of medieval assassins. These enigmatic individuals, often romanticized, move silently within the shadows, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of castles and the dimly lit lanes of towns, all to alter the course of history with a precisely honed blade and furtive words. While the silver screen often depicts these figures with a certain allure, the truth is, life as a medieval assassin was, to put it mildly, a miserable prospect. Before you settle in, I encourage you to show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel, but only if you find my content truly engaging. It would be great to find out where everyone is watching from and what time it is for you. It's always captivating to see our audience's worldwide reach. Now let's create the perfect atmosphere. Perhaps dim the lights and maybe turn on a fan to create a subtle ambient noise. Together, let's prepare to embark on this compelling exploration. Let me make this absolutely clear. In the medieval era, no one awoke with the ambition to slice through a nobleman's jugular vein in exchange for a handful of silver coins and the subsequent honor of hiding in a barrel for several days. Taking on the role of an assassin was not a career choice. Instead, it symbolized the final desperate stop on the life has gone horribly wrong express. For the most part, medieval assassins were not secluded, mysterious figures trained within ancient mountain-top sanctuaries. Instead, they were often individuals driven to the brink of desperation, impoverished peasants, disgraced former soldiers, reformed thieves with a certain aptitude, or people who had already vanished from society's view so completely that the officials wouldn't even notice the difference. In other words, if your name was on the next census, you were safe. If you had any form of privilege, you hired an assassin. If you owned land, held a noble title, or even possessed a humble goat, you were the one giving orders. However, if you'd managed to escape prison for a crime you wouldn't talk about with anyone, had a reputation for discreetly resolving problems, and possessed the skills to inconspicuously enter and exit a tavern, congratulations. Someone was about to slide a leather coin purse across the table and begin with the very specific details. The name mentioned was usually not attached to someone who was easy to deal with. The intended target wasn't the unassuming Bob, the farmer known for his impeccable turnips. It would more likely be a corrupt baron, a bishop with a penchant for avarice, or someone surrounded by a dozen protective guards and guarded by a water-filled moat. The financial incentive might be alluring, while the act itself was likely to be a nightmare. If one made it that far, however, they likely had nothing left to lose. No family, no prospect of a brighter future, and absolutely no access to even basic medical treatment. Furthermore, let's not overlook the complete absence of those modern occupational benefits. There were no retirement plans, no widespread recognition, and certainly no days off for contemplation and personal fulfillment. You couldn't simply advertise yourself as an expert in covert extermination. Instead, you were expected to maintain a low profile, work with extreme speed, and under no circumstances disclose your profession to anyone, particularly not while engaging in boisterous conversation over tankards of ale at the local pub. Oh yes, I'm a traveling carpet salesman. The stains, they go away. So, in summation, the pursuit of becoming a medieval assassin was simply not a dream for anyone. Their path to that profession was paved with pain, hardship, and the unfortunate reality of being cast aside by the very world that created them, often wearing a hood and gripping a rusted, dangerous blade. You weren't cast as the hero. You certainly weren't playing the part of the villain. You were, instead, a mere footnote in the chronicles of history, an individual who made everyone nervous, and who likely didn't survive long enough to fully enjoy the coin they were paid. Now, let's aggressively dismantle the first widespread misconception. Contrary to popular depictions, the apprentices of medieval assassination were not molded within the hushed confines of a secluded monastery, illuminated solely by flickering candlelight, and guided by wise seasoned teachers whose profound wisdom was underscored by melodious flute compositions. There existed no cinematic sequence, no experienced instructor to impart knowledge, and certainly no inspirational speeches aimed at bolstering morale. The training, if one could even call it that, primarily consisted of not perishing during the initial attempts at the profession. The vast majority of individuals who undertook the role of assassin weren't rigorously trained professionals. Rather, they were individuals driven by desperation, possessing a rudimentary understanding of their objective, and capable of navigating silently without any untimely sneezing outbursts. Prior experience in matters of warfare was considered a significant advantage, providing the necessary knowledge of how to wield a knife with proficiency.
Conversely, even in the absence of such familiarity, the act of stabbing another human being is inherently straightforward. However, escaping the scene following the act, with both kidneys still functional, demanded a higher degree of skill, or an abundance of sheer luck. In most instances, it was purely dependent on fortunate circumstances.
No formal training manuals were provided. No introductory meetings were held by the Associated Guild, and no safety instructions were articulated. Essential skills such as identifying a body double or pinpointing the escape routes from a nobleman's sleeping quarters were not formally communicated. These were learned while clinging precariously to a window ledge, while internally pondering if you had inadvertently entered the servants' bedrooms. Poison was a matter of experimentation, with a pronounced emphasis on error. Sometimes the plan's execution led to desired outcomes, while in other instances, the target only suffered moderate dizziness, further intensifying his suspicion of the soup. Alternatively, one may mistakenly ingest the very concoction intended for their victim. Medieval times lacked a specialized poison control hotline that could advise. It was reliant upon the hope, the person reliant on herbal remedies, and the robustness of their digestive system. If one were fortunate, almost as improbable as winning a lottery, a few skills may have been acquired from seasoned thieves or mercenaries. Perhaps an older, wiser assassin might demonstrate how to traverse cobblestone streets without creating noise. Nevertheless, actual mentorship was an uncommon and brief occurrence because assassins don't leave. They vanish, usually forever. The notion of formal weapons training was entirely unrealistic. The assassin didn't carry a broadsword or a long sword. Rather, a concealed dagger or a garrote if the operative was particularly ambitious, along with whatever other tools that could be concealed under their cloak without creating the telltale sound of clinking. Consequently, the practitioner was not a shadowy master of the martial arts, but a person with roughened hands, silent footsteps, and a troubling affinity for alleyways. Achievement did not originate from methodical preparation, but survival. The method of acquiring the necessary knowledge of killing involved acting swiftly, often clumsily, before disappearing from sight to avoid facial recognition and the subsequent posting of their likeness near a church. The instruction the apprentice would receive was harsh, practical, and devoid of any form of official graduation. The consequences were primarily bruising, blood-staining, and the growing awareness that one was entirely alone. Now, let's consider your initial motivations. The allure was the prospect of money, hard currency that could be spent freely to afford the necessities of life. It was the promise that drove the individual to pursue this life. However, the reality involved being compensated with untruths. When somebody sought the services of an assassin, a long-term business relationship was hardly the goal. The objective was a single service with complete absence of paperwork, ideally lacking any witnesses, including the assassin themselves. A pouch of silver would be offered, half paid in advance, and the rest upon task competition. This would happen if the employer was in a charitable mood. But there is something of particular importance that needs to be mentioned.
The completion of the assignment, often relayed by the coded phrase "when the job is done," signified the critical phase after all the work, the moment to assess if the execution was impeccable and devoid of any errors that could incriminate the client. It was the silent confirmation that the operative had not fouled up, exposed the individuals or organizations involved, left behind any tangible evidence, or lived to tell the tale of the escapade to anyone else. This meant moving unseen through the darkness,
consciously placing one's life in harm's way and possibly eliminating a figure of considerable influence, such as a high-ranking lord, in the privacy of his bedchamber. This undertaking was far removed from beauty or romanticism. After the deed was finally finished, upon the operative's return, an unsettling situation arose regarding the promised compensation. The client, using various excuses, had disappeared, leaving the operative empty-handed and regretful. Or, much more frequently, the client attempted to end the assassin's life, likely deeming a quick death preferable to the financial outlay. A blade plunged into flesh was far more economical than handing over the previously agreed upon bonus. Even when the assassin did receive payment, the return was always inadequate. It was never enough to justify the ever-present risks, the shed blood, or the multiple days spent concealed in a haystack in the face of itchy fleas with deep moral ramifications. The assassin received a meager sum of coins, a brief nod, and the ever-present reminder that they were never present for the situation. Adding insult to injury, on occasion, the contracts themselves were fraudulent, carefully manufactured deceptions woven for political advantage. The operative might be tasked with eliminating a prominent enemy only to confront a well-protected decoy, ambushed by guards waiting in the shadows.
This unfortunate occurrence led to a successful assignment, though the operative was immediately led to a sting operation, with their name already inscribed on the designated gallows. Furthermore, even when the arrangement was legitimate, the operative had no legal recourse.
The idea of approaching a court to file a claim, for instance, suing a powerful lord for breach of a contract for assassination, was completely absurd. The only court the operative would have access to would be the one where they were the subject of a morbid display. Armed with these hard truths, the assassin was forced to take what they could acquire, always insisting on payment in advance, and never trusting anyone. Not even the unctuous messenger who promised that this particular undertaking would revolutionize their life. It indeed made a profound impact, but more often than not, it was a truncation of it. The life of an assassin meant existing on a diet of broken pledges and the constant threat of oblivion. So, congratulations, you've accepted the contract. You've been deceived regarding the financial incentives. The expectation of ending your own life is high. Now, let us discuss the tools of the trade. Disregard the fictional tales and the stealth-based video games. There were no extending wrist blades, magical smoky bombs, bewitched daggers, or magically folding crossbows that could be discreetly concealed in high-quality leather boots. The operative's arsenal was comprised of whatever they could obtain through illicit methods, keep sharp, or hide under the cloak that hung on their shoulders without making a jarring sound. If the assassin was fortunate, meaning they came into possession of a gold coin discovered in the cadaver of a man slain, maybe an assassin would be blessed with a finely crafted dagger. Not extravagantly ornamented, not meticulously curved like a dragon's tooth. Rather, the knife would have to be sharp, ideally free from oxidation, and preferably unscented by the previous unfortunate subject that had been stabbed. As for poison, it was available, yes, but less graceful than its portrayal in novels. Most poisons of the era were of unpredictable composition, concocted from plants, minerals, or even the stomach contents of toads. Or the poison would cause continuous vomiting for 2 days, only for the victim to get well. The only result would be that they would become exceedingly angry and suspicious of the next bowl of stew. Ropes were sporadically useful. They could be employed for strangulation, climbing, or to secure an item, but quick proficiency would be required to effectively use. Nothing was worse than the awkward situation of attempting to grapple with a victim while mumbling, "Wait, which knot goes under before the other one?" Again, branches. Success in the endeavor, let's say, was a definite possibility provided one possessed a suitable instrument of death, a fundamental understanding of its operation, and wasn't foolish enough to attempt its clandestine transport within a floral arrangement under the guise of a palace decorator. The unfortunate truth of the assassin's craft was that most terminations were intimate personal affairs. Elaborate displays of marksmanship were rarely feasible. Instead, the execution demanded swiftness, silence, and, ideally, a minimal amount of collateral mess lest detection thwart the objective. Moreover, The concept of redundant resources was a luxury generally unavailable. Should one's blade, for instance, fracture under stress, or inexplicably tumble into a well, the situation demanded a swift, perhaps desperate, adaptation. The improvisational arsenal might encompass a fragment of a slate roof tile, or conceivably, a corroded nail. Every option, however unorthodox, potentially offered salvation. A shoe buckle, wielded with murderous intent, could be considered. These exigencies were a stark reality of the profession. The vital implements were concealed within hems, tucked discreetly within the structure of one's boots, or even secreted inside painstakingly hollowed out loaves of bread, if that's what circumstance demanded. These tools were kept constantly at arm's length, not for security, but because in this particular, dangerous line of employment, your chosen weapon was the confidant, the employer, and the entirety of one's future financial security. There were no provisions for equipment upgrades, nor any opportunities for extensive tinkering between engagements. There was no expectation of elaborate weapon maintenance. The only prayer was that your essential tools wouldn't fail at the decisive moment, because in the final analysis, it was never the weapon that delivered the fatal blow. The assassin alone was tasked with performing this deadly miracle, often with minimal resources and the dubious benefits of whatever makeshift tools were to hand. The nature of the enterprise did not focus on eliminating the inconsequential. An assassin wasn't contracted to dispatch drunken individuals lurking in dark alleys. No one hired you to quietly stab Jeff, the candlemaker struggling to stay awake. The targets were individuals of significant influence. Nobles, religious figures, high-ranking military officials, and occasionally even members of the royal family themselves. And these primary objectives? They were in reality exceedingly difficult to eliminate. First among the deterrents were the guards. Not merely a solitary figure or a small platoon, but often dozens upon dozens. Heavily armored, armed to the teeth, and well-nourished. Some acted as sentinels at the primary entryway, the back door, and everywhere in between. Some patrolled ceaselessly and menacingly, daring anyone to even harbor a suspicious thought. One might invest days simply committing the guards' established routines to memory, familiarizing oneself with the subtle creaks in the various doors, and counting the precise number of steps necessary before the night watchman with the respiratory ailment was compelled to pause for breath. Second, there were the physical obstacles, the fortifications themselves. Castles lacked the welcoming features of a front porch. Instead, those buildings boasted fortified entryways, strategic murder holes, and encircling moats inhabited by numerous hidden threats and unseen dangers. If one managed to evade the watery depths, there remained the hazards of expertly placed arrow slits, along with the very real risk of encountering boiling oil. Your job description, therefore, might literally include the sentence "may be flambéed" for insubordination. Third, the necessity of navigating the presence of an extensive support staff comprised of cooks, scribes, and stable hands. A single misconstrued look, a moment of unintended hesitation on your part, might result in the immediate alerting of the guard captain faster than you could deny your purported role as a harmless herbalist. Assassins were not merely battling sharp metal and drawn steel. They were, in essence, fighting against the insidious power of gossip. And in a medieval society, the phenomenon of malicious rumor would spread with great speed toward potential perpetrators. Finally, your designated target was inherently paranoid, and correctly so. Those in positions of authority were constantly surrounded by potential betrayers, relatives with covetous designs on their titles, along with dozens of sycophants who feigned loyalty. They didn't partake of their food without a designated taster. Without the security afforded by 3 separate sets of locks on their doors, they would be restless. Some were known to utilize decoy beds, or regularly switched sleeping quarters in a deadly variation of the timeless game of musical chairs. Even the seemingly opportune setting of a celebratory banquet presented considerable danger. Yes, your target would inevitably be inebriated, but so unfortunately would you. Moreover, the challenges of penetrating the defenses as an assassin would still include the royal guards, numerous trained dogs, a highly aware jester, and 50 or more potential witnesses brandishing tankards. Simply approaching the intended victim might require weeks of dedicated planning. Infiltrating a castle required cunning methods, pretending to be a mere employee, paying a maid for information, concealing yourself within storage containers such as barrels. When the clandestine assassination finally presented itself, the stakes were immense. You possessed only one opportunity. The action had to be executed with absolute precision, a seamless, silent, and undetectable departure from the scene. Failure meant certain execution for you. Publicly displaying your corpse hanging from the castle gates with a message that sarcastically mocked your attempt was a very real consequence. Consider the archetype of a medieval killer. You probably envision a figure clad in stylish, somber clothing, possibly featuring leather arm supports and a shadowy hood that billows dramatically in the moonlight. However, the reality was far less cinematic. More often, you would assume the appearance of a sickly shepherd with a noticeable secret. Period disguise artistry was laughably rudimentary. You lacked access to bespoke attire or cutting-edge, self-retracting defensive wear. Your resources were extremely limited, whatever you could acquire.
This could mean wearing the clothing of an impoverished peasant, a religious order's oversized cloak, or the remains of a guard's uniform, which most likely possessed a distinct odor. The objective was to seamlessly integrate.
Yet merging with the background meant emulating the appearance of every other person who had refrained from bathing for an extended period, walked with a limp from old injuries, and displayed a nervous tic due to poor nutrition. You didn't attract attention merely through your cloak. Instead, revealing behaviors such as incessantly manipulating your belt to hide a blade wrapped in cheesecloth would betray your intent. Furthermore, masks of the kind we know today were unavailable. Most face coverings served only to make you appear afflicted with leprosy. While such an appearance kept unwanted individuals at a distance, it was hardly suitable for entering formal events. If anyone questioned your identity, you had to formulate a quick response. I am Brother Tobias. I am responsible for silent prayer and maintenance of the roof. Even if you succeeded in getting past the guards, aristocratic households were not populated with fools. Servants paid careful attention to unfamiliar figures, especially individuals who struggled with chamber pots or could not identify the cook's cat. One wrong move would put you in a bad situation. I've never seen you before. Accompanied with a candlestick to the face. Assuming your cover held, you had to sustain the act for hours, carefully feigning disinterest in all the potential targets walking past. Similarly, hairpieces were non-existent. Consequently, if there was a need to give the illusion of age or youth, the only methods available included applying dirt to the face, squinting the eyes, and hoping nobody examined your face close enough to expose that your beard was held on with honey. The truth was that your disguise may have bought you some time, but it wouldn't provide protection in the end. You might gain a few minutes of confusion on your side. After that, you had to disappear entirely, otherwise you had to be skilled at pretending to be harmless. Should your deception be exposed? Well, no one wishes to be the operative caught in the Episcopal laundry facility dressed as a nun whilst wielding a sharpened weapon. Such an outcome is even more undesirable during a festive event. In those days, if you were engaged in such work, there was no backup team. You didn't have an accomplice with a handheld ballistic device, a brilliant chemist to conjure helpful elixirs from a secretive base of operations, or a facilitator to provide you with encrypted messages and unwavering reassurance. You had yourself, a rusty knife, and persistent trust issues. There were no professional organizations to count on. Rumors of shadowy figures, a clandestine society of killers, mostly circulated within the smoky confines of taverns, fueled by the idle chatter of myself and others seeking amusement. The reality was far less romantic. Encountering a genuine professional assassin looking to socialize was rarer than a sighting of the spectral. The emphasis on solitude was paramount. This profession thrived on anonymity. The fewer individuals who knew you existed, the longer one enjoyed their life. Every human connection presented a potential threat, a conduit for exposure. Loose lips were the ultimate danger. Even the person who commissioned your services might not learn your true moniker. If they did, it signified the imminent commencement of your departure strategy. The notion of camaraderie was a ludicrous fantasy. Friends would inevitably ask questions about your life. Lovers would notice suspicious physical evidence, unexplained bruises, bloodstains, and the constant presence of a concealed weapon beneath your sleeping surface. Establishing a permanent home was absolutely out of the question. The costs of such a commitment were too high. A single miscalculation, a chance encounter with recognition in a bustling marketplace, and one's existence would transform into an urgent race towards the closest available escape route. Even amongst other criminals, a degree of separation was maintained. While thieves and smugglers were often inclined to engage in social interactions, your role placed you in a different category. You were the one who made individuals vanish. Consequently, you inspired either fear or, worse, a perception of being a significant danger to those around you. Nobody desired to share a simple meal with a person whose vocation had the potential to attract an angry mob wielding torches. Moreover, empathy wasn't an option. Sharing the internal struggles that came after silently eliminating a corrupt church official was impossible. If you chose to disclose your profession, people invariably assumed you were either fabricating the truth or you might be a danger to society, and their assessment was frequently accurate. Consequently, you guarded your secrets, your physical scars, and your arsenal of weaponry without exception. In taverns, you chose the most inconspicuous positions, typically the darkest corner, your back securely against the wall, your gaze constantly observing entrances. Consuming alcohol in moderation was a core principle. Overnight stays were avoided, if possible. You would never disclose your identity unless compensation had already been arranged. And even then, the name you offered up was likely not the one your parents gave you. To operate as an assassin during the medieval era demanded the mastery of disappearing, not just amongst a crowd, but from any opportunity for a life you could not possess. Envision that you have accepted the contract. You have meticulously planned your access route. You have bribed the appropriate gatekeeper. Furthermore, you have crafted a flawless disguise, transforming yourself into a very convincing chimney sweep. And then the moment of truth arrives, causing paralysis. Perhaps the target pivots without warning, facing you directly. Perhaps they are with their child. Possibly, involuntary tremors overcome you, your knife-wielding hand trembling like a frightened rodent. Consider the ramifications if one of these scenarios plays out. Your demise is inevitable. The price of failure for an assassin in the medieval age wasn't a simple reprimand. It was not a bad performance review that could be fixed. It was a public, agonizing, and exceedingly dramatic execution, often employing ropes, fire, instruments of torture. Failing to complete the assassination meant endangering the entire mission. If the target lived, they would report your violent actions to anyone and everyone. Suddenly, you would be transformed from a phantom into a marked man, with a detailed description and, potentially, a crude drawing plastered on every tavern wall within a short distance. Furthermore, the previously inattentive guards were now highly motivated to catch you. At times, the client posed more of a risk than the target. A failed mission turned you from an asset into a liability. Imagine a target vulnerable to horrific treatment, torture, relentless questioning, potentially an even crueler fate. You're expected to speak, to divulge everything. The very individuals who provided your payment would likely be the first to commission your demise. There are no opportunities for redemption, no apologies granted. The blade miscalculated its trajectory. You might tell yourself to rectify it another day. You were granted only one attempt, a singular opportunity that dictated the course of everything. And if the endeavor proved unsuccessful, the most optimistic outcome would be a swift execution before the revelation of your employer's identity. Failure also carried with it the stigma of profound disgrace. It wasn't merely the inability to complete the assassination. It was a far more egregious failing, the inability to remain hidden, to become the phantom. To fail at being flawless. For an assassin, perfect execution was the quintessential key to longevity. Anything short of this would attract attention, painting an inescapable bullseye upon oneself, forcing the preparation of a final declaration. Accumulating previous successes was essentially irrelevant. Your client won't care that you've completed 12 contracts. In this occupation, your worth is judged exclusively by your latest action. Should your recent attempt falter, immediate flight should be a priority. The objective was achieved, the carefully constructed plan executed perfectly. The weapon found its mark. No cries, no armed defenders, just a clean, final thud as the victim collapsed, and a highly influential person was permanently removed. Well done, and now you should sprint with every fiber of your being. Because a triumph as an assassin during medieval epics did not imply sipping wine on a rooftop as the city burns. It required swift evasion in obscure pathways, the blood of your quarry on the footwear, and a canine already following your tracks. There were no celebrations following the achievement, no socializing with collaborators, no relaxed exchange with the hiring party. You didn't have the privilege of observing your accomplishment. Instead, the instant the steel connected with flesh, your primary task became to evade everyone who now wants to execute you through increasingly horrible methods. Armed men approach, gates that are shut, horses locked far away, likely injured. You must arrange your departure prior to the fatal strike. Routes, deceptive appearances, hidden shelters. Perhaps a boat operator who accepted your favor or simply didn't inquire because the city would be sealed within moments. No one desired any kind of scandal. Lockdown meant restricted access, defended perimeters, and many angry guards, armed with sharp instruments, who all recently received your description in the phrase may be armed and intensely violent. Consider the employer. Assuming they even meant to pay, they wouldn't give you a friendly audience in a bar. They would likely disappear too, because a hired killer who just finished a job is the deadliest person in existence. You possessed too much understanding. You've proven you could infiltrate places where others wouldn't dare. So, triumph meant you left with money in one hand, a huge bullseye on your back in their place. What was the reward? A week of living in back rooms, bribing ferrymen, and shaving your facial hair in concealment, assuming the persona of Brother Lucian, as you joined monks bound eastward. Because triumph was not synonymous with sustained life. The consequence of your actions was the necessity of initiating a fresh existence, relocating to a completely new locality and adopting a novel identity, all the while knowing far more individuals were actively engaged in seeking your capture. Therefore, it's affirmed, you did commit the act of taking a life. Now, swift evasion is paramount.
Should the existence of a medieval assassin lack sufficient hardship, encompassing experiences of poverty, constantly being pursued, and seeking refuge in environments permeated with acrid odors resembling goats, an additional layer of adversity surfaced in the form of the extraordinarily imaginative suspicions and fears held by the surrounding populace.
This stemmed from the fact that in this era, assassins were not simply subjected to apprehension, but were also perceived as being under a curse. To the typical uneducated individual, you transcended the role of a mere murderer concealing themselves beneath a hooded garment. You were believed to be a profane entity, engaging in cryptic conversations with malevolent entities, an individual who supposedly employed substances derived from frogs to anoint their wicked cutting instruments under the celestial illumination of a full moon. What other rationale could explain your capacity to evade detection from vigilant guards and seemingly vanish into the shadows? Rational thinking was not widely embraced within that societal framework. However, the prevalence of superstition reached epidemic proportions. Some professed the ability of assassins to alter their physical attributes, adopting shapes other than their own. Others asserted your invisibility unless subjected to purification through the application of sacred water. One commonly circulated narrative postulated the making of covenants with woodland spirits, granting the ability to infuse death through the structures of walls. Imagine traversing a village and eavesdropping on a woman murmuring, "Avoid eye contact." The assassin is capable of casting a spell upon the infant. Even the tools you utilized contributed to the heightened levels of suspicion. Possessing a small blade would unequivocally announce its origin as being forged within a cursed forge. The act of employing toxins represented witchcraft rather than an application of chemistry. it was highly probable you were tasked to mix it with a severed digit under the watchful gaze of a blood moon. You might anticipate that this prevailing fear could contribute to your self-preservation. After all, people would deliberately avoid your presence, correct? Nonetheless, the actual circumstances proved to be far graver. Those subject to irrational fears and superstitious practices typically don't demonstrate restraint. They don't find the need to engage in inquiry. They instead resort to the use of stones, set things aflame, and voice sentiments such as incinerate him prior to him summoning lightning. That sinister label, the one you were now carrying, tended to incite disproportionate reactions. The instant someone succumbed to an untimely demise, whether the cause was an illness, a random accident, or choking on a chicken bone, someone would immediately mutter, perhaps it was an entity of darkness. Perhaps it was him. Merely being in the vicinity of a questionable death could serve as grounds for active persecution. As a result, continuous migration was obligatory. You needed to remain on the move at all times. Remaining in one place for extended periods of time could rapidly escalate into the situation where a member of the clergy would sound the bell, while 5 visibly enraged farmers brandished their farming tools as if they dedicated their entire existences anticipating the specific moment's arrival. And the consequences were exponentially more disastrous if discovered with any items regarded in a peculiar context. Dried herbs, unfamiliar currency, or even speaking with a foreign accent would be sufficient for someone to be shouting accusations of sorcery while torch was set ablaze. In a society that envisioned monstrous creatures as beings masked in human visages, maintaining a demeanor of excessive quietness, demonstrating extraordinary capabilities, or possessing remarkable agility immediately characterized you as a potential threat. According to medieval logic, such threats warranted prompt termination, preferably through incineration. Regard the act of utilizing poison. It was viewed as an exceedingly sophisticated weapon in the arsenal of the professional killer. A silent execution, devoid of any evidence, accompanied by the absence of sounds or direct confrontation, a mere sip, a momentary difficulty maintaining equilibrium, and finally an audible release of one's remaining life force. This at least was the idealized theory of achieving that result. When put into practice, the procedure of poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was equivalent to attempting to win a bar brawl with only the power of herbal tea and an unsavory mood. First of all, the potency of these poisons was exceedingly unreliable. The availability of a purified form of cyanide did not exist. There was no existence of a neat pill, neatly packaged, that provided quick, efficient methods for ending someone's existence. Imagine possessing the raw materials, assorted flora like deadly nightshade, various fungi, inorganic substances such as minerals, and perhaps even the occasional amphibian. Your tasks involved collecting these ingredients, pulverizing them into a usable form, and devising a means of delivering them to your intended victim. Even under the best-case scenario, you might only succeed in afflicting your target with a temporary bout of discomfort and a heightened security consciousness within their dedicated anti-assassination detail. Precision was completely absent. Precise measurements and quantifiable dosages were unattainable. Instead, the process was a combination of guesswork. Adding an insufficient amount of the concoction would only result in the nobleman merely vomiting and canceling his evening meal. Conversely, using too much would swiftly lead to your own demise from exposure, long before the appetizers could even be served. Furthermore, the settings of medieval kitchens were notoriously unpredictable. Gaining access to the food preparation process to subtly introduce your poison wasn't easy. You might have to resort to tactics such as bribing a kitchen staff member, assuming a false identity, clandestinely slipping in while no one was observant, or, most challenging of all, attempting to contaminate a dish that would be meticulously scrutinized by multiple individuals and a designated animal taster. Yes, a canine companion was often involved. Should your target be of noble status, dining was not simply a matter of consumption. It was a rigorous, well-orchestrated procedure. Every course of the meal would be tasted, blessed, and even smelled by an assortment of individuals, ranging from the household manager to the court jester. By the time the food reached the intended recipient, it had undergone more stringent security checks than the largest royal celebration. Even if the poison was successfully introduced without detection and your mark consumed it, the outcome remained highly variable. Some toxins manifested effects within several hours, others prolonged their effects for days. The moment your target might be freely entertaining themselves with laughter. The next, they could be seizing their abdomen and demanding a consultation with their personal astrologer. And if this person somehow managed survival, whom would they look for as the culprit? Not the kitchen staff, not the food tasters. Your profile had to be that of the taciturn individual with an evident knowledge of botany and unsettling eyes. Therefore, poisoning techniques of that era were not a streamlined process. They were extremely fraught with peril. They were time-consuming, impacted by countless variables, and the vast majority of these factors would function to your detriment. Consider also capture, where justice was carried out by inflicting torture upon you in an attempt to secure a confession, implicating you as a villain capable of poisoning everyone from the most powerful duke to the canine taster. One might expect that if one successfully changed the course of history through, for example, the removal of a tyrannical ruler, the sabotage of a royal dynasty, or silencing a political opponent, one would then find themselves being written in history. However, that was not the reality. Your role was that of an assassin, a title that automatically precluded lasting recognition. The best thing one could hope for would be to become a mere legend, described only as a mysterious figure cloaked in a hood, an outsider with cold eyes, or just the person known for never quite finishing their beer. Some may have pulled off assassinating a major figure of immense historic importance and still disappear from the annals of time. Really, that was the point. The one paying you would not want history or headlines. Instead, they sought absolute plausible deniability. The fewer people who recognized who did the deed, the safer they were and the less chance there was of being poisoned by their own assassin. Your name was erased after your actions were complete. If you decided not to use your own name, your identity remained hidden. You left no signature of your actions. You would not brag or keep trinkets. You were invisible beyond the act. If anyone could identify you, that meant there was still work left to do to ensure complete and ultimate secrecy. In the vocation that you inhabit, unresolved issues were swiftly dealt with. There was simply no room for lingering problems. Furthermore, the concept of honor was a distant phantom. There existed no celebratory recognition for remaining silent. No grand memorials would be erected for those individuals who averted conflict with a solitary blade shrouded in darkness. Should a member of the aristocracy desire a lasting tribute, they would commission a statue of themselves. Your ultimate reward, by contrast, was likely a plain wooden casket, an unmarked burial site, or if fate proved exceptionally cruel, your severed head displayed publicly as a symbol of treason. Your name might survive only to be uttered as a curse, transformed into a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Do not defy the king. Recall the fate of Lord Ulrich? Indeed. And the individual who orchestrated it? Erased, gone like a spirit. This constituted your lasting impact, not acclaim, not dread, but utter oblivion. Your purpose was to disappear, to leave no trace whatsoever. Should you linger, your existence exposed, it represented a critical error because heroes were immortalized in the medieval age, while those in your profession were eradicated from history. Therefore, your survival, your success, hinged upon completing the task and perhaps, remarkably, receiving payment. Even that in itself was something of a miracle. Now, your entire being depended upon staying out of sight, maintaining a low profile, and hoping that your employer would uphold the agreement and shield your true identity. Correct? Incorrect. For in the treacherous realm of medieval assassination, there existed one principle even more inviolable than evading capture, Never place your trust in anyone, most especially the one who writes the checks. Your client, whether a nobleman, a trader, or a power-hungry bishop lacking in ethics, had not engaged your services out of any respect for you. You were recruited because they needed a heinous deed carried out, and you possessed unmatched skills operating from the shadows. Once the mission was executed, you transformed into a burden. You possessed a dangerous amount of information. You knew who had commissioned the death, who was targeted, when, and the motivations, in addition perhaps to knowing how much the client was willing to pay for it. That made you a threat not just to your target, but also to the client. Consequently, what was their usual recourse? They would cut all ties with you. They would deny ever having met you. Or, even more dangerously, they would dispatch another operative to eliminate you, closing the contract with a more permanent resolution than mere paperwork. There were verifiable instances where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to undertake the task and then another to obliterate the first assassin immediately afterward. No financial refunds were considered, only risk reduction. If you dared to attempt blackmail, threatening exposure, such audacious actions were invariably terminal blunders. Because in those times, those of influence did not negotiate with assassins. They eliminated them. If, on the extreme chance, your client possessed even a modicum of honor, in itself an extremely rare trait, you might receive payment and be left alone. However, even in that instance, you must always assume you were under surveillance, with someone already sharpening a blade and analyzing your movements. You personified the secret that could not be spoken and the shadow that could not remain. Even triumph did not equate to trust, because in their estimation, if you had taken a life once, you were capable of killing again. Furthermore, even the individual who orchestrated your employment desired to be spared the same fate. Assuming, against all probability, your resilience allowed you to overcome those who sought your demise. You successfully navigated a treacherous landscape encompassing assassinations, deceptive schemes, and double crosses. You outlived those who assigned you your bloody assignments, as well as perhaps even your own personal moral compass. So, what comes next? The inevitable and often expected golden years of retirement? That's precisely not the case, because in the medieval era, an assassin did not have the luxury of a comfortable pension to look forward to. There were no opulent farewell celebrations, quiet residences near the coastline, or regular payments dispensed in precious currency accompanied by expressions of gratitude. Instead, assassins disappeared completely or met their end, frequently exhibiting both outcomes. The fundamental challenge boiled down to perpetual insecurity. Even if you chose to abandon this perilous employment, the history of your actions wouldn't simply disappear into thin air. You held too many sensitive secrets locked within the confines of your mind, too many identifying handles in your memory, and an excess of blood on your hands that couldn't be washed off. People wouldn't be content with your dignified retirement. Rather, they would expect to have you erased from existence, and usually that meant being buried. And even if no one sought you out, and that's a rather substantial hypothetical, you would forever live with the underlying and relentless worry that someone might. Perhaps a newly emerging assassin, brimming with ambition and eager to prove themselves, had just received their first contract from a clandestine entity, previously known under your own dangerous identity. Therefore, you altered your identity once more. You relocated to a small, unassuming settlement where nobody inquired about your background. You adopted a persistent, but simulated, limp, dealt in herbal remedies, and fabricated a past involving experience guarding some notable figures. Even under these pretense, restful sleep eluded you. You avoided large congregations. You always situated yourself in such a way as to readily observe an entrance or the only exit. You kept your slender blade concealed beneath the floorboards, positioned alongside the satchel of gold coins that you always left strictly untouched because it bore the lingering scent of the only life that you have ever known. Your true nature was impossible to forget, too. Years of silent assassinations and nimble getaways had taken a toll on your psyche. Every rhythmic banging upon your door caused you to wince. Every unfamiliar face you saw along the trail triggered suspicion. You had ceased experiencing vivid dreams because dreaming signified vulnerability. The capacity to love was a forgotten skill. You couldn't permit relaxation. You were unable to express boisterous laughter. You existed like an apparition, feigning humanity. The undeniable reality was that as a medieval assassin, there was no true conclusion to your dark journey. Instead, your life was marked by a slow and chilling descent into unnoticed and forgotten oblivion. Always moving, always observing, until one day you completely vanished into the abyss and no one even noticed. Perhaps that was the finest possible outcome, the best you could have realistically hoped for. By now, you've probably deduced the truth. Being a medieval assassin was not some sort of darkly sentimental lifestyle. It was neither noble nor heroic. The profession, in the big picture, brought minimal wealth. Instead, it was a bleak and often unacknowledged career that was incredibly fleeting and wrapped in blood-stained fabrics, and followed by a crowd of folks who wanted you dead. You were destined to fail, whether that was within a week or even a day, because you were likely to start from incorrect premises. You might envision yourself as stealthy and perfect control, a phantom in the cover of darkness. But in reality, you would actually be cold, starving, and only making one incorrect assumption from the hangman's noose. You'd cautiously enter a settlement, your cape pulled snug around you, ready to undertake whatever deadly mission lay ahead, just to discover that your intended target relocated. The local guards would be inebriated, but still quick to unleash deadly consequences. The informant you hired, the stable boy providing intelligence, betrayed your trust for a paltry reward, a simple ale, and a meager bread crust. Your timing leaves much to be desired. Imagine making a grave mistake, misjudging a moment, and freezing when action is required. Visualize the disastrous scenario. Attacking the wrong individual, a person not intended to be the target. Subsequently, you are exposed by a housemaid who recalls observing your likeness near the church grounds. Suddenly, instead of anonymity, you become the focus, a central issue. What ensues? Hasty flight. However, you are not adapted to the challenging medieval environment. This includes traversing through mud, the uneven surfaces of cobblestone paths, alongside the unpredictable presence of an excessive number of loose chickens roaming the streets. This will include a potential slip, a stumble, ending with you getting taken down by a guard named Thomas, currently going through a breakup and feeling exceptionally irate. Let's consider you were to endure that situation. Eventually, you would confront the adverse outcomes. You would confront a position void of supportive allies, honor, and future prospects. Remaining, you would encounter only rumors, suspicion, and the ever-growing realization that even if you were to succeed, the utmost you could strive for is surviving to an old age, hidden away, concealing yourself using a fake name within a rural community that still holds to superstitious folklore. Therefore, the prospect of enduring is slim. Furthermore, it would be advisable to refrain from pursuing because the career of an assassin was not glamorous. It was a harsh process that consumed individuals, leaving behind nothing but concealment. It granted power without a sense of inner peace and provided purpose without a respected place in existence. You would not create historical significance. Instead, you choose self-erasure. The only outcome awaiting you at the conclusion was a complete lack of recognition, a lasting void that no one would question, seeing as no one would possess the memory that you held a presence to begin with. Prior to ascending to the position of intimidating Queen of Macedonia, Olympus was known as Mrutel, a princess of Maloya, originating from the harsh tribal lands of Epirus. Her kin declared a lineage that traced back to Achilles himself. If an inheritance of heroes truly flowed in her veins remains debatable, one declaration was indisputable. She was never destined for a secondary role in shaping historical events. Myrtle was immersed in mystique and ritual from a young age. Her formative years were not shaped only by political matters. They involved ancient prophecies, emotional practices, and a deep acknowledgement of the old gods. Myrtle was not the type of princess who would engage in courtly behaviors like smiling or embroidering tapestries. Instead, she was drawn to snakes' signs and the excited rituals of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot under the moonbeams, summoning the divine while in states of trance. Beyond superficial worship, her connection with the deities was deeply intimate. She did not merely offer offerings but assumed their natures within herself. Based on historical accounts, most likely written by men who experienced a mixture of dread alongside fascination, she kept sacred serpents in her dwelling, including allowing them to be in the same space as her when resting, possibly even beside her in bed. Whether this was a literal fact or simply slander, something powerful women regularly attract is something we shall never know. But the story persisted. To those loyal to her, she seemed otherworldly. To those who held her in opposition, she was a peril. Her genuine dominance commenced not upon battlefields or within royal chambers. It arose in the hesitant glow of torchlight, amid whispers by priestesses alongside the curling bodies of serpents. She was more than just royalty. In her veins flowed a connection to something ancient, a woman whose awareness transcended the mundane sphere of political maneuvering and possessed an emotional detachment as sharp as a sword. When the formidable Philip II of Macedon, a ruthless and remarkably intelligent leader famed for his unbridled desires, journeyed to the island of Samothrace for a religious ceremony, he encountered more than just a captivating royal figure. He instead stumbled upon an enigma, a puzzle he was unable to look away from. Their union was not simply a matter of political strategy. It represented a convergence of fate and authority. From the very inception, this union was brimming with extraordinary indicators. Some claimed that a bolt of lightning illuminated the heavens on the night they wed. Others recounted how Olympias experienced a dream of a thunderbolt penetrating her body. All these accounts would transform into legendary narratives. Yet this much is undeniable. The bond between Olympias and Philip did not just yield an offspring. It gave birth to Alexander the Great. Olympias, furthermore, was dedicated to shaping her son's purpose from the initial moment he drew breath. The alliance between Olympias and Philip was not the idyllic narrative often associated with a queen destined to conceive an empire. In actuality, it was from its very commencement a volatile combination of prophecies, regal self-importance, and obsessive anxieties and suspicions. Philip, a man of immense power, exceptional oratorical skills, and a well-documented propensity for acquiring spouses, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was likely still in her teens, yet she possessed a maturity far beyond her age. She viewed in Philip a ruler whose aspirations mirrored her own. She may have even considered him chosen by the god to fulfill her predetermined destiny. The kingdom of Macedon was not a welcoming place. It was a land of iron strength and limitless ambition where rulers were frequently victims of assassination by relatives and where brothers would instantly evolve into implacable opponents. Nevertheless, Olympias, the esteemed priestess of Papyrus, entered this realm with her head held high, her gaze already set upon the regal crown. The progression of their marriage was turbulent from the very beginning.
Philip, despite his exceptional understanding of political strategy, did not embrace the concept of monogamy. He subsequently married numerous other women, generally for purposes of forging alliances, but always for advancing his influence. But Olympias, an insightful and strong-willed woman, was not content to remain in the background.
She established her own circle of influence, maintained her strategic partnerships, and consulted oracles and rituals to reveal the future and perhaps to unveil Philip's fortunes. Then the birth of Alexander occurred. That event itself was enveloped in dramatic celestial events. According to the tales, Olympias dreamt that a bolt of lightning struck her womb and flames danced around her child without causing him any harm. Philip reportedly experienced a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. The interpretation of this vision is open, but both the lion and the sealed womb suggest invincibility for Alexander. Whether they actually believed in these dreams or perhaps fabricated them, they carried on as if Alexander was predestined to rule not only a kingdom, but the entirety of the known world.
However, even as the child was celebrated, rifts in the royal relationship deepened. Olympius resented Philip's subsequent marriages, especially that to his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was not merely a personal issue. It represented a direct threat.
Cleopatra was a Macedonian native, and any son she bore would be seen as the purer heir to the local nobility. That posed an immediate danger to Alexander's future. Olympius understood this reality. The palace was not just a home, it was a battleground. Olympia was determined to employ every resource, every ancient symbol, every carefully orchestrated incantation, and every veiled insinuation at her disposal. Her singular focus was ensuring her son's legacy wouldn't merely be a faded memory. She craved his ascent to the highest pinnacle of power. She cast aside her former identity, transforming herself into a figure of absolute authority, a force to be reckoned with akin to the gods residing on Mount Olympus. No person would dare attempt to usurp her son's claim to the throne without facing her profound and relentless fury. As Alexander approached his teenage years, the Macedonian royal residence in Pella had become a turbulent arena, filled with insidious veiled barbs, complex political machinations, and festering deep-seated conflicts. Olympia's fight extended beyond mere political sway. It was a desperate struggle for her very existence. She recognized the court was a den of vipers, yet she was the one who had taught them how to deliver a fatal strike. Philip II, her husband, started to emotionally detach himself from her. He increased his campaigning, engaged in excessive drinking, and, perhaps most damagingly, became more influenced by his Macedonian advisors, who were likely weary of Olympias' domineering behavior. The ultimate blow came when he took a young noblewoman, Cleopatra Eurydice, as his wife, a distinct individual from the later Egyptian queen. This particular Cleopatra, born and raised in Macedonia, had an uncle, Attalus, who proved to be one of Philip's prominent military commanders. This nuptial alliance fell to Olympius as a profound act of betrayal, a full-fledged declaration of war. The wedding celebrations proved to be a scandalous affair. During the banquet, Attalus, under the influence of alcohol, hurled insults at both Olympia and Alexander, openly challenging the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he truly the son of Philip or the offspring of a deity, as Olympias liked to proclaim? This remark was meant as an offense, but Olympia embraced the potential. She welcomed the whispers, and she cultivated belief that her son was infused with divine grace from Zeus. This aura of mythological connection made her son untouchable. Alexander, enraged, abruptly left the feast. Olympia chose to completely depart Macedon, seeking refuge in Epirus, her ancestral homeland. This self-imposed exile was not a retreat, but a shrewd strategic maneuver. In Epirus, she maintained her royal status. She could rally support, quietly manipulate key individuals, and observe the slow disintegration of Philip's court from within.
Philip was assassinated as he was about to invade Persia during the marriage of his daughter. He also approached the point of bestowing upon himself the unparalleled title of not only King of Macedon but the potential emperor of the then-known global community.
The single dominating question that echoed throughout every polished marble chamber and every brightly illuminated hall was, who was the perpetrator? Was it Pausanias, the jilted royal bodyguard responsible for the deed? Was it the consequence of intricate courtly schemes? Was Alexander himself involved? Or, if one whispered very quietly, was it Olympias? No tangible evidence could be produced. No one would dare confront the possibility, but some suspected she masterminded the assassination. In the immediate aftermath, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant son were swiftly eliminated, murdered, according to several accounts, by Olympias herself. The serpent, having retreated, had now returned to the palace, having removed all obstacles to her son's coronation. With Philip dead and Macedon grappling with grief or disorder, Olympias commenced her carefully planned operation. While the others struggled and took time to understand the implications of Philip's absence, she acted swiftly, brutally, and with decisive resolve. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the recently wed Macedonian queen and her mother's rival, was eradicated. According to frightening accounts, Olympia never simply killed her. Instead, she made her termination a symbolic and public spectacle and designed it to be exceedingly humiliating. Accounts differ concerning Cleopatra's demise, with some indicating she ended her existence by hanging herself shortly after witnessing the execution of her infant daughter. Another version suggests that Olympias ordered the child to be cast upon a funeral pyre. Regardless of the specific scenario, one point of consensus is the utter lack of compassion displayed. Olympias grasped a stark reality that many women of position within the ancient royal courts failed to acknowledge. Mercy was a weakness within the confines of a palace. A rival child, no matter how insignificant they might seem, signified a potential future opposition.
Olympias had no desire to remain in a defensive posture any longer. With Cleopatra and her lineage eliminated, Olympias could then focus on securing the throne for Alexander. Her adolescent son, known for both intellect and bravery, and already having received tutelage from Aristotle, ascended to the throne with little resistance.
However, one shouldn't misinterpret the circumstances of this ascent. It wasn't solely his personal attributes or his father's legacy that facilitated his rise. It was Olympias. She possessed the astute knowledge of which military leaders to subtly intimidate, which nobles to skillfully cajole, and which adversaries to permanently eliminate. She wasn't merely safeguarding her son's ambition, she was deliberately orchestrating it. Alexander himself didn't always condone these methods. Reports suggest he disapproved of the actions taken against Cleopatra's family. His reluctance to intervene stemmed from an underlying recognition of a truth Olympias had always understood. The pursuit of power often required a shedding of blood. Furthermore, in the realm of Macedon, bloodlines offered both advantages and inherent risks. With her son now crowned, Olympias began to gradually withdraw from the spotlight of public affairs. This wasn't a retreat into retirement. Instead, it represented a shift from overt action to behind-the-scenes manipulation. While Alexander prepared his ambitious campaign into Persia, she remained behind, not passively as a queen mother, but as the spiritual protector of his ultimate destiny. She sent him holy relics, sought guidance from oracles, and practiced religious rituals on his behalf, all of which were strategically designed to support her objectives. Olympias saw her son's endeavor as far more than a military undertaking. It had divine significance. Alexander was not merely embarking upon an armed conflict. He was fulfilling a divine prophecy. She staunchly believed that as long as she lived, no potential opponent, whether Macedonian, Persian, or originating elsewhere, would sabotage that divinely ordained purpose. She had successfully placed her son on the throne and had cleared the palace of any obstacles. Now, she would fiercely defend his growing empire, operating discreetly from the shadows, ready to spring into action when needed. As Alexander advanced eastward to conquer the realm as it was known, Olympias remained in Macedon, a queen without a crown, but undeniably a source of tremendous influence. Her formal title was Queen Mother.
Yet, there should be no doubt regarding her true standing, she governed in all but name. Although the stewardship of the kingdom was nominally entrusted to Antipatros, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, Olympias refused to be marginalized. She wrote frequent missives to her son, offering guidance, issuing warnings, at times issuing reprimands.
These were not mere letters of affection from a doting mother. They were political assessments, infused with prophetic pronouncements and a palpable undercurrent of hostility. And Alexander, many miles away, carefully read every single word. She constantly reminded him of those who truly opposed him. She expressed doubts about the allegiance of his advisors. She questioned his interest in the Persian traditions, his selection of wives, and his consideration of declaring himself a god. No one else could dare to say these things to him. But Olympias never hesitated to speak, whether as a mother or as a proponent of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew increasingly bitter, constantly undermined by Olympias at every turn. Olympia utilized her position, her religious standing, and her familial lineage to incite resistance against his authority. Her sphere of influence extended throughout Epirus, Thessaly, and within the upper echelon of society. As effectively as wildfire engulfs a landscape, she could disseminate speculative narratives, and with the support of Olympus's favor, a subtle suggestion held a destructive force surpassing sharpened steel. Simultaneously, her correspondence with Alexander became increasingly demanding. She voiced her concerns regarding Antipater's relentless pursuit of power, depicting him as another Philip, intent on treachery and usurpation. Irrespective of whether she held a genuine belief in this assessment or simply worried about losing her influence, she incessantly urged her son to take action against the general. However, Alexander displayed reluctance given his need for Antipater to maintain stability within Greece while he engaged in military campaigns in Asia. Consequently, the growing discord between mother and head military official intensified. Olympia observed the situation, patiently waiting. Behind her outwardly religious and maternal facade, her level of tolerance dwindled. After experiencing years of political maneuvering, she had no intention of being governed and/or controlled by a senior military leader. With Alexander's expansive empire spanning from the Hellenic world to the Indian subcontinent, Olympia noted the initial fissures. He was overextending his resources, trusting a multitude of foreign advisors, and becoming increasingly detached from the protective embrace of his mother and the gods he served. She was convinced that his success originated from divine privilege and her own presence. If he abandoned these truths, well, Olympia understood how the gods could remind leaders of their inherent status, even if this leader happened to be her own offspring. When the announcement of Alexander's demise in Babylon in 323 BCE reached Macedonia, it did not arrive with a blaring announcement. Instead, it struck a blow, like a concealed blade. To Olympia, this wasn't merely the loss of a son. It represented the collapse of a kingdom she had invested years in building and expanding. Her cherished son, the divine force which she had foretold would rise, a force she had raised and unleashed upon the world, was now deceased. He departed, leaving behind no defined path to the future, no unequivocal heir, just disorder. The colossal empire he had constructed was already beginning to fragment. Military commanders, the so-called successors, were already partitioning his territories, vying for control like vultures surrounding a carcass. Antipater, still in position in Macedonia and Greece, felt little affection toward Olympia. To compound matters, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being pursued by competing military overseers in attempts to seek a marriage alliance. Each general had hopes of exploiting her royal heritage to legitimize their authority over the kingdom. Olympia saw what was coming. Armed conflict was no longer a possibility and now was inevitable. Once again, she would be forced to take action. But she no longer had Alexander. His bloodline was what she possessed. His infant son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had wed. Roxana, currently residing in Macedonia, remained vulnerable. The young boy was even more so. Olympia recognized the infant as the last true embodiment of her son's legacy, rendering him a target, but also a means for securing advantages. She aligned herself with Roxana and the child, determined to protect them and manipulate the newborn's claim to the throne to establish her own dominance in the political landscape. Yet, the dynamics were transitioning. The top generals who once paid reverence to Alexander now showed no inclination to defer to his widow or his mother. They possessed armed forces now, ambitions, and unresolved grievances. Olympia didn't waver. Olympia, a woman who had stared down danger in many forms, including treacherous individuals and powerful monarchs, was not intimidated by a few ambitious warlords, particularly those brandishing hastily acquired crowns and weapons they had seized. She instead began to meticulously strategize, patiently awaiting the opportune moment. She observed the passing of Antipater and the subsequent ascension of his son, Cassander, a man known for his calculating nature and a complete lack of empathy for those deemed inconvenient, especially the former queen who was accustomed to getting her way. It became evident that a confrontation between these two formidable figures was unavoidable. The woman who had given birth to Alexander the Great, the serpent-like mother figure, and the ruthless Cassander, who wished her silenced, were on a collision course. While Alexander was no longer alive, his influence lingered. The legacy of his reign was still present, and Olympia, from the depths of that legacy, was ready to exact revenge. Years after Alexander's passing, as his vast empire descended into a devastating internal conflict, Olympia initiated her most audacious gambit. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving maternal figure, but as a powerful political entity, driven by a sense of divine retribution. The established system of governance was crumbling. Cassander, the son of her long-standing rival Antipater, was aggressively consolidating his authority, and Alexander's widow, Roxana, along with their young son, Alexander IV, were effectively imprisoned. Olympia recognized the looming danger. If she failed to take decisive action, her grandson would soon disappear entirely, reduced to nothing in the tumultuous politics. Therefore, she formed an alliance with Polyperchon, an elderly military leader and general, who possessed the remnants of recognized legitimacy. Olympia would return not as a beggar, but as ruler. Supported by Polyperchon, she arrived in Macedon at the head of a substantial military force. The instant her feet touched Macedonian soil, everything changed. Numerous cities opened their gates to her forces. Soldiers defected, joining her cause. Even some of her historical adversaries wavered. The very name Olympia, even after her years and perceived vulnerability, had the effect of shaking the very foundations of the country. Her vengeance then began. She systematically hunted down the loyalists of Cassander, ruthlessly eliminating all who stood in her path. When she eventually captured Philip III, the mentally unstable half-brother of Alexander and a mere puppet ruler, she ordered his execution. According to some accounts, his wife, Eurydice, who was also a captured subject, was offered the option of taking her own life, although she resisted, and Olympia then had her murdered by strangulation.
It was a calculated act of extreme violence presented through a veneer of royal formalities, and Olympia, with her penchant for theatrics, orchestrated the scene as though it were a matter of divine justice. Her public message was clear: only those who were directly descended through Alexander were allowed to rule. Others were nothing more than impostors.
For a short, electrifying period, Olympia held absolute dominion over the kingdom. She had successfully restored the dynastic line. She had avenged numerous betrayals. She had demonstrated to the Macedonians the power of a ruling figure, especially when the person was a woman with nothing left to lose. But the political arena of Macedon was like a fire in a dry field, and any sense of calm was temporary. Cassander was still strategizing, patiently waiting to regain control. He returned with a vengeance. His army was superior in numbers, his resources plentiful, and his methods far crueler. Her allies began to desert her. Polyperchon's influence diminished. The tides turned. Olympia, now isolated within the stronghold of Pydna, watched as her enemies approached. She had ignited the fuse. Macedon had burned, and soon the smoke billowed as her adversaries closed in. The end for her inevitable. In ages long past, Olympus, a figure who once instilled terror in the hearts of many, unexpectedly found herself trapped and embattled inside the Pydna fortress situated along the coast. She was utterly isolated, with no aid forthcoming, besieged by the formidable forces of Cassandra. This relentless siege was a continuation of a vendetta commenced by Cassandra's father. Remarkably, Olympus exhibited no desperation. She neither supplicated nor implored for mercy. For an extended period approaching a year, she withstood the unrelenting pressure of the siege, exhibiting an unwavering resilience comparable to an immovable statue seemingly sculpted from the very essence of fury.
Essential resources such as provisions became increasingly scarce. Sickness stealthily infiltrated the fortress walls, relentlessly depleting its inhabitants. Allies who were once there had disappeared like fleeting visions.
Despite these escalating hardships within those fortified walls, Olympus stubbornly maintained that same commanding presence which had once compelled whole kingdoms to tremble. Until her final moments, she comported herself not as a captive, but as the mother of a divinity. Cassandra, ever wary and circumspect, hesitated to end Olympus' life. He fully understood the inherent dangers associated with ending her existence. Even now, she was enveloped by a potent narrative, a myth that shielded her like impenetrable armor. She was, after all, the mother of the legendary Alexander the Great. Striking her down could easily be interpreted as a sacrilegious act, a direct insult to the gods. Consequently, he offered her a chance to live and prosper. He proposed that if she surrendered, her life would be preserved. Olympus, however, was too astute to trust such pronouncements. Her experience had shown her far too many instances of royal promises disintegrating into nothingness. Nonetheless, the lack of sustenance had advanced from mere discomfort to a looming specter of mortality. Her garrison, weakened by despair, began to falter, and supporters ultimately succumbed to defeat and put their hands up. Having maintained her unyielding composure until the very end, Olympia was finally handed over to the control of her opponents. Cassandra, understanding the complexities, did not personally orchestrate her death. Such an outcome would have been too straightforward and, in a sense, too kind. Instead, he transferred her into the hands of the families who had suffered at her hand. These were individuals who had been subjected to her decrees during her brief but tumultuous return to power. She was condemned to death as per their judgment. Despite this decree, an unexpected obstacle presented itself. When the executioners arrived to carry out the sentence, an eerie paralysis descended. No one dared to make the first strike. Olympus stood erect, exhibiting a regal demeanor, her silence amplified, her gaze fixed upon them, resembling a prophecy personified, piercing straight through the smoke. These were Macedonians, people who had grown up immersed in tales of Olympus' arcane rituals, her prophetic visions, and the symbols of her power in the form of slithering serpents. They had once passionately celebrated her son as a divine figure. Now, they faced her directly, a frail, elderly woman still enveloped in the captivating myth. Not a single man present possessed the fortitude to wield the killing blade. Consequently, Cassandra was obliged to dispatch a new group, foreigners, individuals unconnected to her legacy, people oblivious to her past eminence. They were simply bound to their orders, and in that manner Olympus was finally struck down. This execution was not delivered with respect, nor was it conducted according to the codes of what was expected.
The moment arrived. Quiet was the only witness to her death. Her demise effectively marked the end of Alexander's line of descent, and with it, the disintegration of the legacy, the very foundation of an empire that was built on lofty heavenward ambition.
Even in passing, Olympus left a lasting shadow, an enduring mark. History forever would recall the Serpent Queen. Her end did not occur on a gilded throne. Rather, she perished in the dust, devoid of any defenses, abandoned by those she once dictated to, and executed by those same people she had once ruled. However, the course of history is known to be a capricious thing. It does not always bestow favor upon those who depart from the world within the embrace of utmost luxury. Sometimes, it prefers to retain the memory of those who met their end with a fierce defiance. Olympus, it became clear to everyone, was not destined for a passive remembrance. During her life, she utilized her role as a mother as a formidable weapon, and she wielded prophecy as an impenetrable shield. She was more than merely the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects, the vital foundation that birthed his ultimate rise to power. Had she not been there, the very myth of the divine child would have never been born. There were no ceremonial rites echoing with the fury of Zeus's thunder, no brutal elimination of adversaries to pave the way for a young sovereign to dominate the known globe. Olympus, the mythical home of the gods, didn't merely give rise to an immense kingdom. It protected its interests with unwavering tenacity. Despite the ruthless nature of those in power during ancient times, the figure of Olympia stands out. She wasn't personally engaged in military campaigns like Cleopatra or charging into battle as Boadicea did. Her dominion was exercised in a less conspicuous but even more perilous arena. Her realm was one of poisoned chalices, strategic alliances forged through marriage, enigmatic priestesses, and divinely inspired prophecies. She possessed a profound understanding of the potency of fear, but more importantly, she grasped the immense power inherent in faith, convincing others that her son was a divine being, and perhaps even believing it herself. Those who were opposed to her branded her as a killer, an alleged practitioner of witchcraft, and a master manipulator, and their assessments were, in many ways, accurate. Olympia embodied all these traits and more. She was a product of a harsh world, where strategic acumen was more highly valued than compassion. She learned early on that clemency was a privilege that queens, particularly those in her position, could rarely afford. Over the expanse of history, she was both vilified and romanticized. Some saw her as a malevolent figure, while others viewed her as a visionary. But no historical expert, whether in ancient times or the present day, could deny her significance. She lingered in the background of Alexander the Great's history like an ephemeral specter, always present but hidden from direct view. And it's possible that this was her most appropriate place. She was not simply a grieving mother or a footnote in a monarch's narrative, but rather a narrative of her own making. She was the woman who immersed herself in prophetic pronouncements, who shared her bed with serpents, and who outlived even the gods. Olympia's physical form has long since decayed. Her bones have returned to the earth. Nevertheless, her reputation persists across the ages, echoed in every telling of ruthless queens. In every murmur about inherited destinies, in every empire built on carefully constructed myths, she remains, lurking in the shadows, patiently waiting. Situated on Crete, a sun-scorched island, just a short distance from the modern city of Heraklion, there rests a ruin that seems more like a vision than a physical reality. Stone passageways wind and meander in every conceivable direction. Rooms twist and duplicate themselves. Staircases conclude abruptly, going nowhere. It's easy to feel disoriented even after many visits. This remarkable place is Gnosis, the heart of the Minoan civilization and a potential inspiration for one of humanity's most enduring legends, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before the legend took shape, there was an actual palace, unlike any other. Erected around 1900 BC and expanded over centuries, Gnosis was, far more, than a royal residence. It was an entire city under a single roof. Covering an area of roughly 150,000 square feet, the palace complex included over 1,000 rooms, elaborate light shafts, numerous storage chambers, places of worship, workshops, and what might have been the first flushing toilet in history. It featured running water, multi-level apartments, and an intricate system of air circulation. This was no simple fortress. It was a true masterpiece of engineering and design. For modern archaeologists, Gnosis appears to be a testament to controlled complexity. For those who saw it in ancient times, it most likely invoked feelings of astonishment and wonder. The person who brought Gnosis to the attention of the modern world was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the initial years of the 20th century, a researcher named Evans commenced archaeological investigations at the site, quickly forming the conviction that this very location represented the genesis of the legendary Greek labyrinth.
The arrangement of the site gave a sense of bewilderment, and the architectural style was rich with symbolic meaning. Around every corner, he encountered representations of bulls, painted on the structural surfaces, etched into stone,
or crafted in the form of diminutive gold pendants. The bull, after all, held great significance within the Minoan culture. Consequently, Evans went so far as to christen the civilization after the mythical king Minos. Whether the figure of Minos was historical or pure fabrication, the legend of his reign became inextricably linked to the unearthed ruins. But here's a curious development. An actual labyrinth, in the physical sense, has yet to be discovered. There's no elaborate network of subterranean passages, no chambers intended for confinement, and certainly no monstrous being merging human and animal forms. Instead, what's been revealed is something far more intriguing. A city planned with intricate convolutions of rooms, extensive wings, and multiple layers. This resulted in a layout that made navigation difficult by design. Therefore, the deeper one delves into the site, the more the distinctions between documented history and mythological accounts become blurred. Thus, the central question remains, was the Minotaur, that horrifying creature, a creation of these walls, or was the palace itself the beast? Gnosis might not readily give up its secrets, yet it's exceptionally adept at provoking thoughtful inquiry.
The well-known narrative of the Minotaur is as renowned as these ancient remnants, a frightening figure, merging man and bull, confined within an impossibly complex labyrinth from which anyone who entered never returned. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, succeeded in destroying the creature and escaping, thanks to a thread provided by Princess Ariadne and his own cleverness. However, from where did this captivating story originate? And precisely why a labyrinth? The very earliest iterations of the mythic narrative speak of King Minos, the autocratic ruler of Crete, who exacted a yearly tribute from Athens consisting of 7 young men and as many young women. These victims were sacrificed to the Minotaur, a being born from divine retribution and disgrace, confined within an underground maze. It served as a potent symbol of the concealed, menacing facets of governance, something primal, lurking beneath a veneer of grandeur. Crete was viewed by ancient Greeks as a location of wealth, mystique, and dread. The skilled seafarers of the region, the Minoans, were considered both sophisticated and alien. Their religious practices included bull leaping, their artistry featured unusual deity figures, and their palaces were completely unmatched on the mainland. For a Greek visitor from around 1000 BCE, Knossos would have undoubtedly felt like stepping into another realm. The bull itself held profound religious importance in Minoan society. Certain wall paintings show young men and women vaulted over charging bulls in ceremonial performances. Symbols of consecration, constructed in the form of stylized bull horns, can be found on the rooftops and in the sacred areas.
Combine this with a palace that resembles a maze, and the necessary ingredients for a powerful legend are readily in place. However, what if the Minotaur was not simply a monster? What if it was, in fact, a complex metaphor? Some scholars propose that the saga is a recollection of Cretan dominance over the Aegean, a period when Athens was essentially a tributary state to a more powerful and perhaps strangest civilization.
The labyrinth could represent the political entrapment of the less influential states, while the Minotaur could personifying the raw, frightening power underlying Minoan influence.
Alternately, other academics suggest a more psychological reading. The labyrinth is comparable to the unconscious mind. The story of the Minotaur in its essence reflects the primal forces within us, embodied by the monstrous creature, while Theseus represents the courageous part of ourselves venturing into the unknown, guided only by the faint trail of recollection. However, the relationship with the Palace of Knossos and the myth's intricate tapestry is evident. The Grand Palace is arguably the most compelling physical representation we have of what a truly elaborate labyrinth might have been. Absent are a horrifying beast and a helping hand, yet something more profound and intriguing is to be perceived. It's not solely a mythical account echoing through the passing of civilization, but instead a narrative that naturally evolved and became a myth. Long before the magnificent temples of Athens or the military prowess of Sparta, there was the Minoan civilization, one of the first sophisticated societies within the boundaries of Europe. They thrived not through acts of domination, but through trade, artistic expression, and a remarkable aptitude for architecture that appears almost supernatural.
The core of their prosperity resided at Knossos, a palace that transcended the role of just a royal seat. It served as a flourishing center of culture, ritual, and economic activity. The Minoans experienced their golden era, thriving from approximately 2600 to 1400 BCE. Originating from Crete, they engineered a widespread trade network encompassing areas such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even extending to the distant coastlines of Spain.
Their vessels navigated the Mediterranean like swift, silent arrows, transporting goods such as pottery, saffron, bronze objects, and various luxury items. Rather than constructing extensive armies, they fostered alliances. It was this network, more than any military force, that contributed to their affluence. What truly distinguishes the Minoan culture is its stark contrast to the civilizations that followed, specifically the Greeks. Their artistic creations celebrated nature, animals, and the seamless fluidity of human movement, as opposed to focusing on warfare and divine condemnation. Frescoes depict graceful dancers, playful dolphins, and athletic figures vaulting over bulls. Even their goddesses possessed unique characteristics, frequently seen as commanding, bare-breasted figures often portraying snakes, which potentially represent concepts like fertility, transformation, or protection.
Dominating this civilization was Knossos, which was not simply a fortified structure perched atop a hill, rather, it was an intricate complex situated in a fertile valley. The absence of imposing defensive walls suggests that the Minoans either felt secure on their island or exhibited enough influence to render defense unnecessary.
Their sense of protection stemmed from their architectural achievements. Multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and intricate plumbing systems hinted at a society significantly advanced for its era. Yet, despite their remarkable level of refinement, the Minoans left behind no understandable written records. Their primary writing system, Linear A, remains undeciphered to this very day. We are ignorant of their self-designated title. We are uninformed about the beliefs of their rulers, the prayers they chanted, or the actual events that transpired within the confines of Knossos. All we inherit are their remaining ruins, their artwork, and the indirect impact that was subsequently absorbed by the Mycenaeans and reflected in Greek mythology. The Minoans were not solely palace builders, they were the creators of an enduring enigmatic legacy.
Furthermore, Knossos was not simply a building, it symbolized the vibrant essence of a civilization that flourished briefly, like a ray of sunlight on the Aegean Sea, before ultimately disappearing. However, some maintain that its legacy resonates throughout the maze.
To wander through Knossos is to traverse through time, a journey that is characterized by various layers, complexity, and mesmerizing beauty. The enormity of the structure is not the sole factor that overwhelms the visitor. Instead, it is the deliberate design. Various rooms intersect, creating a series of connected spaces. Corridors suddenly bifurcate or disappear. Light wells penetrate the very center of the building. Stairways descend into shadowy depths or unexpectedly emerge into areas filled with sunlight. Nothing follows a direct pathway. It's readily understandable why those who first encountered the ancient structure might have murmured the word labyrinth. The palace complex of Knossos was more than just a dwelling place. It possessed a vitality, a suggestion of sentience. Spreading across an estimated expanse of 150,000 square feet, the structure comprised over 1,000 individual rooms. Numerous tiny chambers were present alongside spacious halls. However, these interior spaces were not haphazardly arranged. They were meticulously crafted and included workplaces for artisans, areas for storing goods, dedicated sacred spaces, living quarters, and areas designated for the rulers of that time. All of these were carefully planned, organized around a sizable central courtyard that may have served as the location for public ceremonies or events relating to bull leaping rituals. Furthermore, the immense palace was constructed on multiple tiers, reaching up to 4 or 5 stories in certain sections, utilizing both natural inclines of the terrain and human-created terraces.
To journey through this intricate layout without becoming disoriented, one would need exceptionally good memory, a strong instinctive sense of direction, or perhaps a guiding thread like that of Theseus in the mythological narrative. Despite its apparent disorder, remarkable ingenuity is evident.
The Minoan people possessed a sophisticated knowledge of passive ventilation, cooling the interior spaces by employing air shafts and expansive stairwells. Moreover, they implemented clever drainage systems, channeling collected rainwater through clay pipes, and even developed toilet systems that flushed, predating the Romans' adoption of this technology. One of the most iconic elements of the site is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair, integrated into the wall and flanked by seating benches. The surrounding walls are adorned with frescoes featuring griffins, mythical creatures believed to be protectors. But the true function is unknown. Was this designed for a priest-king's reign? Was it a sacred space dedicated to a goddess, or an area for ceremonial rituals? The purpose of the room remains a mystery. Also, the walls within Knossos tell a story through their vibrant hues. Detailed frescoes depict marine life, such as dolphins gracefully swimming above bathing areas. They portray women styled in elaborate tiered skirts and showing bare chests. And then young men are witnessed leaping over bulls midair. Such artistry was not merely ornamental. It was a form of self-expression, a statement of identity. These images, fluid and natural, are deeply connected to the environment, specifically the sea and land. Yet, the further one ventures into its depths, the more confusing Knossos becomes. Certain portions of the structure seemingly were specifically designed to be complex, almost as if intended to mislead. That complexity might be how the labyrinth's legend took root. It was not necessarily a prison for monstrous beings. Instead, the palace felt alive. It was a building intended to evoke feelings of wonder, a space for ritual, and a hint of trepidation. There were no locked doors, nor were there mythical beasts to be encountered. The palace simply evoked a sense of questioning one's surroundings and what mysteries might be concealed just beyond the next turning. Knossos was not simply a center for administration or a royal residence.
It was a place of divine worship, an architectural manifestation of the Minoan spirit, deeply rooted in ceremony, mythology, and enigmatic spiritual forces. Unlike later Greek temples with their towering columns dedicated to Zeus or marble sanctuaries to Athena, the spiritual dimension of Knossos is more subtle, woven directly into the structure's very fabric. Secret shrines are concealed in obscure corners. Pillars rise as if they are guarding the holy grounds, and stylistic bullhorns, carved and symbolic, appear atop roofs and altars. Throughout the site, the image of the bull predominates, indicating a potent relationship between worship, the natural world, and this highly revered animal. The Minoans did not seem to fear the bull. They celebrated it. The well-known bull leaping fresco within Knossos is more than an athletic depiction. It may represent a religious ceremony. The young men and women are observed vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of peril and elegance. This was not sport, it was a sacred form of theater, possibly a sacrifice to the gods or a symbolic defeat of chaos. Furthermore, within the storage chambers beneath the palace premises, archaeologists unearthed the snake goddesses, whose effigies are regarded as prime examples of crafted Minoan treasures. These sculptures depict bare-chested figures with arms outstretched, either grasping or entwined with serpents, radiating an aura of command. These are not intended to be humble deities. Rather, they are believed to protect the domestic sphere,
as well as possibly represent concepts of procreation and existence itself. The Minoans associated snakes with ideas of transformation, regeneration, and enigma. The creatures were regarded as inhabitants of both the earth and its hidden depths. The compartments that housed these idols suggests they served as domestic shrines or ritual locations. These were secluded, reverent spaces nestled within the palace's bustling heart. When considered with the existing frescoes, sculptural horns, elevated platforms, and the labyrinthine passageways, the entire structure begins to evoke the feeling of a ceremonial complex, a designed marvel intended not solely as accommodation, but as a means to connect with the divine realm. There was no central temple within Gnosis, since the palace itself functioned as a temple. Its arrangement, aesthetic components, and structure all reflected a spiritual perspective that blurred the division between the spiritual and practical realms.
This was an environment where mythology was integrated with architecture, where an avenue might serve as a portal to the celestial beings, and where every resonance within the stone chambers might have once been a hushed invocation. Gnosis was not merely a residence for human beings, it was a sanctuary for the gods.
For numerous centuries, Gnosis flourished as a symbol of abundance, inventiveness, and cultural refinement. However, at some point, an event transpired, a sudden happening that remains unexplained to this day. Approximately around 1400 BCE, the palace was deserted, the artwork was left to fade, and the Minoan culture, which had once controlled the seas, disappeared, fading away like a fog over the Aegean Sea. What, then, was the catalyst for the downfall?
Various explanations have been proposed. Some attribute it
to an event of nature. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini, erupted in one of the most extensive explosions ever recorded in human history. The colossal impact probably triggered tsunamis that battered Crete's northern coast, devastating harbors and farmlands. Ash could have obstructed the sun, causing viewer climatic instability. While Gnosis was not immediately decimated, the repercussions of the eruption may have destabilized its economic, political, and spiritual foundations.
Others cite the possibility of conflict. Around 1450 BCE, the emerging power of the Mycenaeans, who originated from mainland Greece, may have capitalized on Minoan vulnerability. Archaeological findings indicate that Gnosis was briefly repopulated, but the culture had been altered. The artistic style took on a more militaristic tone. Linear A, the Minoan writing system, gave way to Linear B, used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once celebrated snake goddesses and bull dancers now echoed with an alien language. Some researchers propose that the Mycenaeans did not conquer in a single, violent act, but rather gained dominance gradually over the island.
They started by exchanging goods, exerted influence, and eventually took control. Others contend internal disintegration, such as a civilian uprising, governmental instability, or elite failure, could have been equally contributory. What's amazing, though, is the scarcity of outward indications of conflict in the remains. There are no charred skeletal remains, nor are there indications of widespread bloodshed. Gnosis did not collapse with a cry. Instead, its decline was silent. The grand palatial network just faded from existence. The rooms fell silent. As ceremonial practices concluded, the natural world gradually began to reclaim the land. By the point in history when Homer composed his poetic accounts of the Cree, Gnos had already transformed into an ancient myth, a narrative interwoven with tales of regal figures, fearsome creatures, and intricate mazes.
This circumstance may be appropriate since the demise of Konos was not solely because of volcanic activity or external aggression. Instead, it was the relentless passage of time. This reality ultimately affects all substantial accomplishments, regardless of how glorious, that inevitably fade beneath the rise of subsequent powerful entities.
Nonetheless, remnants persisted, and if we listen very carefully, the structure still resonates beneath the surface soil. For several millennia, Gnosis remained concealed beneath the Cretan soil, relegated to the status of just a pile of stone, gradually fading relevance. Its name was lost to time, its origins misrepresented, and its walls were concealed by surrounding vegetation and dust. That all remained unchanged until an individual decided to pursue a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and his contributions were far greater than just rediscovering Gnosis. He provided a renewed perspective on it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist who possessed a flair for dramatic presentation and a deep interest in Homeric tales, acquired the property that covered the ancient remains. Local farming communities had been discovering peculiar seals and artifacts, indications that something of considerable scale was beneath the surface of their land. Evans began excavation. What he unearthed would revolutionize our understanding of Ion's past. He discovered a palace of such vast proportions, intricate design, and advanced construction that he held the conviction that this was the legendary domain of King Minos. Frescoes, the representary domain of King Minos, and the overall unusual architectural features of the location all served in his judgment to signify the presence of the labyrinth. Evans was more than just an archaeologist. He was a composer of stories with a proclivity for creating controversial perspectives. He termed the individuals responsible for the construction of Konos as the Manawants, a name derived from Minos. He analyzed symbols, reconstructed fresco fragments, and revitalized certain sections of the palace using reinforced concrete, an action that has generated both acclaim and critique. Some refer to this approach as visionary, while others view it as vandalism, since what is currently visible at Gnosis represents a combination of aged ruins and Edgewardian imagination. However, Evans achieved what no one else had dared to attempt. He resurrected Kos's past. He provided Europe with a glimpse into a Bronze Age epic that long predated classical Greece, a civilization distinguished by artistic innovation, enigmatic practices, and maritime elegance. He also unearthed the yet-to-be-deciphered linear, a script opening new inquiries about language, literacy, and the boundaries of our historical awareness. Evans did more than just unearth stones. He revived a legend and impelled scholars to face the realization that behind the fabled labyrinth existed something tangible, nuanced, and profoundly human. A palace that resembled a maze, a civilization that faded into obscurity, and a man who peeled back the earth only to find a narrative more curious and captivating than he'd anticipated. Gnos had been dormant for a period of 3,000 years, and Evans initiated the event that brought it back. When visiting Gnosis, the experience involves more than just observing architecture. It means immersing oneself in a symbolism language. Frescoes, carvings, and patterns are all-encompassing elements. Nevertheless, the Manawans did not leave behind a Rosetta Stone for us, and their principal script, Linear A, is still incomprehensible. Since we cannot access their spoken words, their sentiments are preserved instead in the artwork they left behind, manifested on plastered surfaces, meticulously carved into architectural elements and concealed within the designs and motifs they employed. Deciphering their intended message presents a captivating challenge. The artistic expressions of Konos exhibit a striking divergence from the conventional aesthetic frameworks observed in antiquity. Unlike civilizations preoccupied with military prowess, where narratives of triumphant rulers and hardened warriors took precedence, the Konosian artistic lexicon embraced a distinct set of themes. Their creations celebrate the wonders of the natural world, showcasing elements such as playful dolphins, flourishing lilies, soaring birds in flight, and the imposing presence of sacred bulls. The human figures depicted are imbued with vitality and grace, frequently engaged in dancing or participating in ceremonial rituals. Even artworks suggesting scenes of jeopardy are infused with a sense of musical cadence and a synthetic appeal. The Minoans did not seek to document their military achievements. Instead, they focused on the celebration of the cyclical patterns of life and potentially aspects of the organization of the cosmos. The most emblematic symbol associated with this civilization, the double axe, or labres, appears ubiquitously in shrines, on wall paintings, and etched meticulously into stone artifacts. The consensus is that the axes were religious symbols, possibly connected to female deities or celestial phenomena. Some researchers propose that the very word labyrinth might be derived from labris, suggesting the labyrinth wasn't a deliberately complicated maze, but instead a house of the double axe, a sanctuary rather than a designed obstruction. In addition, highly stylized bull horns, so-called horns of consecration, were often found mounted on walls and altars.
These may perhaps have functioned as indicators, segregating sacred zones from areas of ordinary function. Such motifs, alongside frequent representations of bulls and the depiction of bull leaping ceremonies, underline the deep spiritual connotations of the animal.
While agreement is lacking regarding its precise meaning, whether it symbolized nature, reproductive potential, disorder, or a divine presence, the bull's presence throughout the Cnosian aesthetic landscape remains undeniable. Furthermore, the very arrangement of the palace at Konos may possess symbolic import.
Certain archaeological analyses suggest the palace was built not only for practical purposes, but also with the aim of mirroring celestial or seasonal cycles.
Its meandering passageways and interconnected chambers could represent an initiation into life, through mortality, and ultimately into a realm beyond, akin to a spiritual labyrinth instead of a physical enclosure. Yet, with the absence of a script that's been deciphered, every hypothesis balances precariously between revelation and pure subjective interpretation. The Minoans expressed themselves through symbols, not narrative accounts, so we are forced to interpret. What profound insights does Konos possess to deliver? We perceive the rhythms, examine the pictures, but the intent remains just beyond our grasp, like an elusive thread that pulls away into the sphere of myth. Konos is undoubtedly in ruins, but it does not feel depleted. To navigate its halls today is to feel a subtle undercurrent, a suggestion of something more. This is not the presence of ghosts or gods, but echoes of stories, existences, and persistent queries. Thousands of years after the decline of the civilization, Konos still captivates us in its maze. The site attracts tourists, archaeologists seek to find answers, while authors create fresh new narratives stemming from its lingering impression. Though the Minotaur may simply be mythology, the compelling feeling of the labyrinth is real. We are not certain who held dominion over Konos. We are without comprehension of the names of their monarchs, queens, or spiritual leaders. We do not know the prayers they whispered or the laws they held dear. But we know their affection for beauty. We understand their reverence for nature. We know they had an appreciation for the balance between construction and art, between ritual and daily life. And we know they were innovators. Long before famous structures like the Parthenon, the iconic Roman Empire, the holy temples of the Hebrews, or the opulent palaces of Persia graced the world, there existed Gnosis. It was a palace unlike any other, a sprawling structure that essentially functioned as an entire city. Furthermore, this complex was also seen as a sacred place, resembling a temple. This enigmatic structure may have also had links to a compelling narrative. The labyrinth, perhaps, was not merely an inescapable prison or a complex riddle, but an intricate story etched directly into the very fabric of its construction, a legend manifested in architectural terms. The widely known tale of the Minotaur didn't spontaneously erupt from nowhere. It originated from this very location, emerging from the convoluted network of its corridors, the profound respect dedicated to bull-related ceremonies, and the immense sense of wonder it ignited in countless generations who desperately tried to understand its purpose. The ancient Greeks transformed the physical reality of Gnosis into a gripping myth. Modern scholars transformed it into an area of study, using archaeological methods to understand the location. However, at its foundation, Gnosis has always been both a physical place and something more. Presently, we can freely stroll through its remaining relics under the sun. We can take photographs, create detailed maps, and even rebuild its original frescoes. Yet despite these advancements, the essence of mystery remains. The division between documented evidence and the compelling legends that are attached to it still wavers and reflects like heat shimmering above the cool earth. Perhaps one key reason Gnosis has persevered through the ages is its refusal to provide definitive answers. It compels us to recognize that occasionally the past isn't meant to be thoroughly examined and dissected. It is intended to be experienced. Therefore, Gnosis, this ancient place obscured by the passages of time and only partially remembered, isn't just a location on a map. It presents a compelling puzzle. It's a question that challenges us, drawing us deeper into its secrets with each subsequent step. And just like Theseus, we are all continuing to seek answers, driven by that invisible thread. Initially, ancient military engineers understood the importance of the battering ram, which was used to destroy fortifications. The earliest examples of these destructive tools were portable devices that were easily wielded by hand. Groups of soldiers would lift a large timber, for example a tree trunk, and aggressively slam it against enemy defensive structures, just as the same manner as woodsmen felling trees. However, over time, the battering ram was significantly improved. Engineers soon realized that mounting the ram within a mobile frame, often protected by a covering to shield the operating soldiers from attacks such as arrows and boiling liquids, enhanced the ram and transformed it from a fundamental tool to a terrifying weapon of war. The Assyrians, renowned for their proficiency in siege warfare, transformed battering rams into weapons of psychological terror. Their towering siege structures integrated the rams with platforms for archers, meaning that not only were a city's gates being destroyed, but the defenders were constantly under assault. Bas-relief carvings recovered from Nineveh illustrate these weapons, with their iron-tipped prows, progressing towards the gates of defiant cities like overwhelming, slow-moving instruments of destruction. Furthermore, these rams weren't exclusively deployed against the city's main entrance.
They were also employed to penetrate weakened protective walls, smash watchtowers, or cause entire gates to collapse. Their presence, therefore, signaled one inevitable alternative: yield or become witness to the destruction your defenses, as they succumbed as swiftly as bread left out too long. The ancient Greeks brought about further refinement. The Romans then improved it to perfection.
Roman engineers built especially large rams, known as ares, the Latin name for ram, and they were suspended by chains or ropes within immense shelters. In some instances, the devices were so large that dozens of men were necessary to operate them. To those who were there and witnessed it, the rhythm of the swinging beam of the ram was likened to the sound of thunder, echoing across layers of stonework. Despite the simplicity of the ram's engineering, it needed immense cooperation to be effective. Operators were under pressure to maintain the device's consistent swing while also protecting it from various threats, which included flaming projectiles, rocks, and other unpleasant substances hurled from above. If a ram was damaged or became stuck, it was rendered useless.
Despite the inherent limitations, a battering ram, once in motion with sustained force, proved virtually invincible. The clash involved organic materials versus constructed defenses made by humans. It was an application of primitive physics, made into a weapon of war.
This was merely the starting point for the innovative methods engineers would design to dismantle protective barriers. While the battering ram represented brute force, the catapult offered a strategic approach to conflict. Instead of relying on close-quarters attacks like a ram, catapults function from a distance, launching projectiles and instilling psychological fear within the besieged. These were essentially the earliest forms of long-range artillery implemented in the history of armed conflict. Furthermore, they dramatically reshaped the nature of siege warfare by strategically exploiting physics, producing devastating effects that must have seemed inexplicable to the enemy. The earliest instances of catapult systems arose in ancient Greece near the 4th century before Common Era, a product of inspired designers who sought to improve the range and power of weaponry. Dionysius the tyrant of Syracuse, notorious for his preference for advanced military technology, initially funded the creation of torsion-powered catapults, utilizing tightly twisted bundles of animal sinew or hair functions of powerful tension springs. These were not simply oversized versions of simple slingshots. They were crafted with precision and used for the deliberate infliction of terror during sieges.
The exceptional attribute of these devices resided in their engineering. Inventors comprehended they could store significant amounts of potential energy by twisting ropes tightly, often composed of animal sinew. When that energy was released, it could propel stones, projectiles, or even ignited objects over several hundred meters.
There were quickly two primary categories of catapults that emerged. The ballista, which launched substantial bolts in a fashion mirroring a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which could throw substantial stones over fortifications or directly onto defensive structures. Subsequently, Roman engineers, never deterred by a notion originating in Greece that they couldn't improve upon, adapted and perfected the existing techniques. The Romans created catapult designs that could be disassembled, loaded onto transport vehicles, and reconstructed at the targeted location. These were essentially siege machinery developed for the convenience of professional armies. Some Roman catapults possessed the ability to fire stones weighing 60 pounds with alarming velocity, a destructive force that could easily penetrate wooden gates, ramparts, and, at times, unfortunate combatants on the opposing side. Catapults served a function beyond simple destruction.
They were often used to stage impactful displays. Ancient military leaders used them to communicate, even transmitting written messages. Corpses were launched over walls to generate disease and distress among the residents of the city. Decapitated heads were also hurled into trapped cities to undermine the fighting spirit of the defenders.
A truly horrific practice involved launching diseased human remains across enemy lines as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults were far from perfect. They were voluminous, required thoroughly trained crews, and their functionality could be compromised by terrain challenges. Nevertheless, when fully prepared correctly, they could be employed to wear down a city from a safe distance. And for the initial time in history, cities recognized that their high stone fortifications needed to survive not just ground attacks. Their defense now needed to contend with the air, where weaponry could be deployed. If the catapult was ingenious, the trebuchet was an enormous machine of impressive form. It was tall, noisy, and formidable. It was the clear champion in medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the field of battle, it did more than represent just a weapon. It presented a clear message. It indicated your walls are insignificant. Opposed to its tension-based counterparts, the trebuchet operated using gravitational force. Central to its design involved a straightforward concept, a long swinging arm positioned on a firm framework containing a substantial counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Upon releasing the weighty payload, the trebuchet's arm would snap forward in a forceful arc. This motion propelled the sling, delivering its lethal cargo high above fortifications, destined for the enemy's ranks.
This was a carefully calibrated method of destruction, its effects both anticipated and utterly complete, rendering significant damage. Delving into the past, the trebuchet's lineage can be traced to those early traction designs, pioneered by the Chinese as early as the 4th century before Common Era. In those times, the motive force was supplied by human effort rather than counterweights, which would come later. Conversely, the counterweight trebuchet, a variant that revolutionized the nature of siege warfare in European and Islamic nations, would not emerge until the 12th century, potentially gaining traction through Byzantine or Muslim contacts.
This ingenious design quickly spread throughout Europe, being embraced by castle builders and utilized during the Crusades. Its destructive capabilities were truly remarkable. A well-constructed trebuchet could launch projectiles weighing close to 300 pounds, propelling them over distances of approximately 300 meters. Massive stones, akin to room-sized objects, would crash into defensive towers, causing walls to crumble and subsequently eroding enemy morale. However, the true power of the trebuchet stemmed from its inherent ability to arc. A trebuchet could carefully loft ammunition over fortified walls with a degree of precision unattainable by catapults.
This allowed for strategic strikes against vulnerable sites inside. Instead of merely degrading defenses, the ordnance battered courtyards, army barracks, and essential supply areas.
Not confined to stones, trebuchets could project a range of items, diseased animals, burning tar, pots of quicklime to obstruct defenders, and even messages or insults carefully secured to the projectile. Historical accounts, like the well-known siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland, speak of Warwolf, a trebuchet of such imposing size that the defenders surrendered even before its initial firing. The king in charge, wanting to evaluate its capability, rejected the surrender so the weapon could be tested. While capable of great destruction, it's important to remember that these trebuchets were not rapid-fire machines. Their construction lasted hours, reloading took minutes, and they called for trained engineers. Nonetheless, no other siege weapon had the same combination of range, raw power, and psychological effect as the trebuchet, which made it the most impactful weapon of its time. It was, in essence, a medieval manifestation of a slow-moving battering ram from up above. And when the counterweight plummeted, cities held their breaths, fully aware they were being attacked by a formidable foe. While catapults attacked from a distance and large battering rams directly assaulted gates, siege towers offered a more intimate, up-close approach to warfare. They were capable of moving right up to the enemy's primary defenses, disembarking weaponized soldiers to initiate the combat. Consider a colossal, wheeled wooden structure, coated in wet animal hides to counter fire and populated with archers and spearmen. This was a siege tower, essentially the historical antecedent of an armored transport, a mobile defensive complex all in one. When one of these towering edifices began their slow approach towards a town's fortifications, the onset of a true engagement became immediately apparent. Siege towers were anything but subtle. They were grand, conspicuous, and extraordinarily potent when well implemented.
Historical evidence suggests that the Assyrians could have possibly been pioneers in their usage during the 9th century BCE, and they continued to evolve, with the Greeks and Hellenistic kingdoms playing a key role in advancing the designs for theatrical effect. During the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian commander Demetrius built a 9-story behemoth, called the Helpolis or Taker of Cities. Its total height exceeded 100 feet, it was equipped with numerous catapults, was also covered in iron plates, and was propelled by thousands of soldiers.
It also broke under its own weight at one point, highlighting engineering challenges. However, the ambition was noteworthy. The fundamental reasoning for siege towers was a simple but deadly one. Defensive fortifications are only effective when preventing access is successful. However, siege towers were developed to circumvent this very principle. These towering structures provided attacking forces with an elevated vantage point, allowing them to overcome the defenses of a castle or city by bringing them at the level of the defenders. This was often accomplished by creating a ramp-like platform where troops would then dismount and get onto the walls. Archers positioned atop these wooden behemoths could unleash a barrage of arrows, pelting the defenders below. Troops on the lower decks were prepared to storm the walls.
These towers were far from perfect, however. They were slow to move and inherently susceptible to various forms of attack. Mud could mire them, slowing their advance or becoming a strategic obstacle, and they served as prime targets for defenders employing incendiary arrows, heavy stones hurled from above, or even by altering the ground to impede their progress. Clever defenders often constructed countermeasures, such as digging trenches, creating flooded moats, or building additional interior walls. A strategy called counterscarp defenses, specifically designed to block the tower's approach.
Nonetheless, when these siege towers operated successfully, the effects were spectacular. A breach in a wall was a serious setback, but suddenly finding your own ramparts crowded with enemy soldiers was an entirely different level of chaos in comparison. In essence, siege towers fundamentally altered the battlefield from a struggle fought horizontally to a vertically oriented contest where winning was a race to survive. They turned height into both an advantageous asset and a potential point of weakness. Once the gangplank of a siege tower connected to the castle's defenses, there was no turning back, which signaled the beginning of close-quarters conflicts marked by ferocity. While battering rams shattered gates and trebuchets hurled massive projectiles, some of the most destructive siege strategies were executed subtly underground. The practice of siege tunneling, also known as sapping, was the dark art of undermining a city's foundations, literally removing the earth beneath it. The objective was simply ancient and terrifyingly effective. Digging beneath the enemy's wall, supporting it with timber, and then setting those wooden supports ablaze was the main method. When the wooden beams burned away, the tunnel would collapse, bringing down the wall's foundation with it. The city could be fortified one moment with impregnable masonry, and in the next moment, a large segment of the exterior wall could crumple like brittle bread. This method relied on stealth. Siege tunneling had no magnificent engines or earth-shattering launches, but it was the stealthy, nearly invisible way to claim a city. Early implementations of it were practiced by the Assyrians, but this method reached full mastery during the reigns of the Greeks, Persians, and later, in the medieval European armies. In the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans initiated tunneling operations underneath the walls, only for the defenders to counter by digging their own tunnels and intercepting them mid-dig, turning the soil into a desperate battle. This defensive strategy, known as countermining, added an unsettling element to siege warfare, creating a nightmarish environment. One could imagine soldiers working underground, in total darkness and possibly hundreds of feet below the surface, straining to hear the sounds of enemy picks. The moment they heard such tapping, they would rush to intercept, frequently leading to intense, claustrophobic struggles fought by the flickering light of torches armed with nothing but knives and shovels in the dimly lit tunnels. It was a harsh, terrifying process involving suffocation and constant exposure to rubble. When employed successfully, however, these tactics had exceptionally devastating results. One of the most gruesome examples occurred in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. The forces of King John initiated a tunnel under the southern wall, packing the tunnel with pig fat, then set it ablaze. The props failed, resulting in the destruction of the entire tower above. This shocked the defenders, who very soon surrendered. Around the 1200s, the role of siege engineers evolved into one of specialized expertise. These individuals possessed remarkable skills, excelling in the identification of architectural weaknesses within fortifications, meticulously assessing soil conditions and its response to stress, and ultimately orchestrating planned structural failures with chilling accuracy. These engineers were, in essence, a combination of geological scientists and demolition experts. Tunneling, while demanding significant investment in time, manpower, and a degree of daring, underscored a critical reality of siege warfare. If an attacking force was unable to surmount the defenses by climbing over the walls, and they failed at breaching them directly, there remained a viable strategic option, undermining the structure from beneath. However, the intense drama of siege conflicts wasn't solely the province of the attacking force. For every battering ram constructed or siege tower deployed, defenders employed their own lethal strategies. Sometimes, these defensive tactics involved incendiary measures. To begin, let us examine a particularly devastating example: Greek fire. This terrifying compound was developed by the Byzantine Empire around the 7th century of the Common Era.
Greek fire was a mysterious, napalm-like substance, known for its persistence. It adhered tenaciously to surfaces, including ships, walls,
and even human flesh, and continued to burn vigorously even when submerged in water. Launched via elaborate siphons or hurled in clay containers, it created scenes of absolute pandemonium. The exact recipe for Greek fire remains a perplexing enigma to this day. So secretive was the formula that it was lost to history along with the Byzantine Empire, but its horrifying effects remain legendary. Entire naval armadas could be reduced to smoldering husks in a matter of minutes. And this harrowing weapon represented just the initial layer of defensive strategies. For less technologically advanced defenses, boiling liquids served as the preferred weapon choice. Scorching water, oil, or sand would be poured from defensive murder holes, the small openings ingeniously built into the ceilings of imposing gateways or towering structures, directly down onto any invaders positioned below. Oil was held in particular dread. Unlike water, it possessed the capacity to adhere to skin, saturating clothing, and clinging to protective armor before subsequently being ignited. Envision the horrifying experience of ascending a siege ladder, only to be confronted with inescapable flames. Hot sand, although possibly less visually dramatic, was brutal in its own way. It would infiltrate the spaces between armor plates, especially around the neck or wrists, resulting in agonizing second and third degree burns that cooked the flesh beneath. It might not have seemed particularly impressive from a distance, yet it transformed fearless warriors into screaming, incapacitating wrecks within mere seconds. Defenders also leveraged the established principles of physics. Gravity was transformed into a formidable weapon. Enormous rocks, massive wooden logs, or even the carcasses of dead animals were hurled from the defensive parapets onto siege equipment or tight formations of enemy soldiers. The objective transcended mere killing. It encompassed the destruction of enemy machines and the concurrent shattering of their morale. Moreover, there were numerous traps employed. These included concealed pits, strategically designed collapsing bridges, and barricades studded with sharp spikes. Castles were cunningly engineered into puzzles designed to inflict debilitating pain, delay movement, and cause general confusion and suffering. All of these defensive tactics served one fundamental purpose: to delay the inevitable. Each minute a defensive wall could withstand an attack represented a moment longer until enemy supply lines dwindled, disease ravaged their camps, or desperately needed reinforcements arrived. Siege warfare was fundamentally a test of endurance. While the attackers often possessed the advantages of physics, the defenders countered with their ingenuity and a considerable supply of strategically deployed boiling wrath. During the brutal context of siege warfare, unadulterated destruction was only partially an objective. The other pivotal goal was psychological control, that is, breaking the defender's will to fight before the very walls were breached. Siege weapons were not simply armaments. They were monstrous, groaning, fire-spewing evocations of impending doom.